Welcome you back to the ICJ Kenya Rule of Law webinars, this time to spearhead conversations on salient issues of electoral reforms and election management in Kenya ahead of the 2022 general elections. We are streaming live from ICJ Kenya House. Thank you for finding time to join us to moderate today's session. My name is Silas Kamanza and I'm joined by my colleague
Santana Simiu. In 2013 and 2017, the Iabc resorted to technological solutions to improve the electoral process integrity in both general elections. This would guarantee the trust of all stakeholders following the disputed and violent elections of 2007. The integration of technology into the results management system inspired hope that the perennial challenges of results management involved in counting, tabulation, transmission, and declaration of results would be overcome.
Now, despite all these substantial investments and expectations raised through the integration of technology, the Iabc in the past has not delivered as expected in terms of determinacy of the franchise in a single voter register. Further, the brutal murder of Mr. Chris Musando, the Iabc ICT director on the eve of elections, only increased fears that the system would be manipulated. Later, the petitions by the opposition and the consequent annulment of the presidential election confirmed these irregularities. Now, while electoral technologies can bring great benefits in accuracy, speed, efficiency, and effectiveness to the process, they also pose challenges in the fields of security, costs, sustainability, and transparency. For example, we can see in Estonia, Switzerland, and Norway, the use of online voting brought mixed results because of technical glitches, voter mistrust, and credible worries about internet vulnerabilities and transparency. We saw in Nigeria, there was an issue with the card reader validation, where it was seen that it created a false assurance on credibility that made it easy for candidates to stuff ballot boxes. Later in Malawi, the European Union also reported that there was inadequate time to actually audit and clean the roll. In Uganda, we saw that observers and the opposition raised concerns over election disparities, regardless of this tech to register, being used to register and verify voters. In Malawi, it was seen that the biometric registration was used as a technique of manipulation to suppress the registration in opposition areas by sending inadequate equipment and undertrained teams.
The COVID-19 pandemic will give impetus for Kenya to enhance the use of electronic voting. We've seen since the outbreak of the pandemic, we've seen a large number of people have been working from home. We even saw the judiciary resorting to virtual hearings and so on and so forth. So it is for this reason that we convened today's webinar so that we can interrogate the divergent issues. Please post your comments and questions to our panelists who will be able to answer. To engage us in the discussion is a panel of distinguished experts, jurists, legal and IT practitioners who have immense understanding of the subject matter. With us today is Dr. Seema Shah, the head of democracy assessment at International IDEA. She formerly worked at KPTJ. We also have Francis Angila. He is a governance and management consultant, formerly a legal expert in the Cradler Commission. We also have Dixon. He is the regional director for Southern and East Africa at the National Democratic Institute. And last but not least, we have Lynette Kwamboka. She is the founder and CEO of Data Science Limited Kenya and Africa Program Manager at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Karibuni.
To our participants, please stay tuned as we tackle pertinent questions on electoral technology. We invite you to engage the panelists on the chat and Q&A section. Leave us your comments, your questions, or raise your hands if you'd like to call in during our plenary session. Please also keep engaging us on our social media platforms, on Twitter at ICJ Kenya and on Facebook at kenyansection.icj. To kick off this discussion, please allow me to start with our first panelist, Dr. Seema Shah. She was heading the research at the Kura Yangu Sauti Yangu. and also which was part of the KPTJ ICJ Kenya group, which undertook monitoring and evaluation of the credibility of the election based on data, which led to petition number 4. Looking back at the experience in 2017 election, what challenges, Dr. Sima, do you think were faced in utilization of technology in the past general election? Over to you, Sima.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ICJ, for inviting me to this panel and to my co-panelists who I look forward to hearing from soon. In terms of challenges with regard to technology, I'm just going to break it up into 4 parts. The first part, as we all know, is biometric voter registration. So I want to emphasize that with what we saw in 2017 with BVR, when we look specifically at the kits, the BVR kits, there wasn't so much of a problem with rolling out and implementing the use of those kits. The problem actually, as it was in 2013, was with the integrity of the register. So what we saw, for instance, was that when KPMG was doing its audit, it projected that there were more than 1 million dead voters on the roll, which was very similar to the number that the Kriegler Commission had quoted in its evaluation of the register of voters back in 2008. And so we didn't see very much improvement, right, in the quality of the register in that sense. We also saw almost 200,000 records, people's ID numbers in the register of voters, not matching any record in the national database of ID numbers. So we don't know where those 200,000, who those 200,000 people were. We saw multiple people with the same ID numbers. We saw first-time voters going to register biometrically and found that their records were already in the register, though they had never registered before. Then we also saw cases of dead voters being moved out of their home constituencies to other constituencies. So all these kinds of problems, really made us doubt the credibility of that list. This was compounded by the fact that when KPMG was doing its audit, it didn't have access to the full scope of data that it needed to really do that audit comprehensively. So for instance, when it was looking at death records from the Kenyan government, from the ministry that handles those records, between 2012 and 2016, it only had access to 19% of the records. So if it's trying to, comprehensively audit the register and it doesn't have all the records it needs, there's no way that it's able to do that well. Then we move to EVID, or the electronic voter identification devices, which again, of course, there were glitches here and there on election day, but overall, using those kits was not a problem. The problem came with the fact that there was a paper list being used in addition to the list that was on the EVID kits. So if you went to the polling station, put your fingerprint on the scanner, and your record could not be found in the list, then the Iabc had leeway to go to a hard copy list and look to see if it could find you there. And civil society's question at the time was, why are there 2 different lists? Why can you find someone in a paper list and not on the digital list? Of course, it's good to have a check on the digital list, right? But that check should be the same. So the question is, why are those lists not the same? And of course, there was evidence that the black book or the green book or both were being used during registration. So even though the Iabc had poured all this money into technology, it was still relying on manual notebooks to record people's registration details. So that really begs the question of why is the technology being used if this other unreliable method is still being used? And then finally, we come to the results transmission system and the portal, which was a new thing in 2017. The portal, as we all remember, was where the public could see the results being posted as they became available. So, I don't need to remind anyone here that the electronic results transmission system failed completely in the middle. So it just stopped working. So that was obviously a huge problem. But the bigger problem, I think, was that the results that were showing on the screen were not always accurate. So when in the constituency tallying centers, for example, some of the results showing didn't correspond to what had been counted. In some places, no results showed. And then in other places, there was a mismatch. What we found, what civil society found during the second petition was that the results forms that were posted on the portal were actually different from the results forms that were in hand, the hard copy results forms in possession by the Iabc, and that was found out during the scrutiny process. So which forms were the right forms? Why were there different forms posted online than were kept by Iabc? So, and that doesn't speak to the fact that, of course, there were a bunch of other problems with results transmission. So unlike EVID and BVR, which went rather smoothly, with results transmission, there were also problems with the actual flow of the system. So polling station officers were not always able to transmit their results to constituency level, and then to county level, and then to BOMAs, because the system was not foolproof. And so that leads me to these questions around, well, what contributed to these failures? And I would say the first thing is that there was poor infrastructure to support this technological plan. And by infrastructure, I don't just mean the technical infrastructure, which of course was weak. For instance, just a few days, if I remember correctly, before Election Day in August of 2017, the public was told that up to 25% of polling stations didn't have the network coverage necessary for those Keams kits to work, for the electronic results transmission to work. So if you don't have connectivity from a quarter of your polling stations, and there doesn't seem to be a plan in place to address that so close to Election Day, that obviously casts doubt in the public's eye about how well things will go. So in addition to that kind of technical infrastructure that was missing, we also saw that, throughout the process, it didn't seem like Iabc really was in control of its own systems, right? It didn't seem to really own it and have the authority to manage it with decisive action and with clear answers. And we saw this in the Supreme Court trial when the Supreme Court ordered the Iabc to open its servers and show the data that was in there. During the trial, we were told, the public was told that they couldn't access the data from the servers because the servers were not in Kenya, and the people who were accessing the server for them were asleep. That doesn't sort of promote public confidence, that if you can't access the data behind your results, when the Supreme Court calls on you to do so, that's a problem, obviously. In addition to that, we saw that there was a lack of clarity around the whole results transmission system. So, of course, the election cycle is made up of much more than results. But for the public, really, the majority of attention is focused on those results and the transmission of results. And so when you come to the results and you see different forms, and then the forms that are posted have all kinds of errors on them, and there isn't a clear answer from Iabc on how those errors are resolved. So what happens when the math on the form is wrong? What happens when there's no signature on the form? What happens when the internal consistency, the numeric consistency within the form is not there? How are those issues resolved? If the public doesn't have an answer on that, then they can't verify themselves the results, which is a constitutional provision that the public should be able to independently verify the results of the election. And then there wasn't a sense that there was a clear sort of integrity to the manual part of the system, right? So like I said, of course, you need to have a check on the technological tools that you're using. So you should have maybe a paper-based system to act as a check, but there needs to be credibility around that paper-based system. So how are you securing the integrity of the papers that are coming from the polling stations that don't have network coverage? How do we know what's happening with those forms? And what happens to the results that were transmitted without a photo? So some places, polling station agents keyed in the numbers and sent that result to the next level, but that result was supposed to be accompanied by a photo of Form 34A, right? And that photo was not always there. So where is the check? And then other things that I think contributed to the problems were internal factionalization within the Iabc, which we all saw in the aftermath when memos were leaked, which showed that commissioners were divided. And so if you don't get a sense that your commissioners are on the same page with regard to what the problems are and how to address those problems, then that creates doubt. And then of course we saw Commissioner Akombe leave in the middle of the whole thing, and she left and said publicly that the reason she left was fear. And so then if you take that in addition to the murder of Nsando before the election, it makes you wonder about how united and how on the same page the commissioners are. And then of course there were tight timelines, right? So there were delays in the delivery of the technology. There was delay in testing. The testing that was done also was not transparent. The Iabc only released electronic results tests from certain counties, not all counties. And then there were court decisions that were happening very close to election day. So the Iabc had to figure out how to account for court decisions that impacted how they rolled out procedures very close to election day, which of course also made it very hard for the Iabc. And I will just stop there for now.
I'm really glad that you're here. I remember we took part in the petition number 4 of 2017. And I remember one of the largest questions is the issue of court decisions coming very close to the election date. But I also remember that there was one instance where we sort of got evidence and we were not able to go to court with that evidence at that last point. And this came out of the data that came out. But also just to quickly ask you, in terms of your experience during petition number 4, one of the major issues was sort of looking at that in terms of capacity of looking at that electoral technology. Do you think like sort of civil society had enough capacity to audit whatever data that was coming in from there?
I mean, I think it's hard to do an audit in real time. So I would say that civil society has the capacity to do a post-election audit, but in order for that to happen, it needs access to the data, and that access doesn't exist. And I think, forget civil society, just the public at large still doesn't have polling station results from 2013 or 2017. All polling station results, those results have not been published for the public. And if you're using a digital system that records all your results, it should be very straightforward to sort of, quote, print that out and publish it, right? That's one of the perks of having a digital system. So I think one of the questions going forward is, why are those results not available?
Yeah, and I remember as well that there was this company, the Otimofo, that had actually gave out a memo saying that we are not ready to move into the fresh election. And I remember civil society who are going to say that Iabc is not ready to undertake this fresh election during this point. So my question to you quickly as we move to the next speaker is, do you think Iabc at that last point with all these things happening, was Iabc really ready to undertake the fresh election?
No, I don't think Iabc was ready. And I believe Commissioner Chebukati said that to the public and then reversed his position quickly afterwards. But he did say at one point that Iabc was not ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Sima, for that. As we continue with this conversation, I'm sure that there's a lot that is coming out, and some of these things we are going to pick up in terms of advocacy. Just to enhance our conversation, allow me to welcome Lynette Kwamboka, as she had been introduced, the founder and CEO of Data Science Limited. Lynette, from the technical side, do you think it is actually possible for us to achieve a dependable and secure IT and ICT system in a general election? And what do you think can be made to make this system more secure? Over to you, Lynette.
Great, thank you very much, Silas, and to everyone for organizing this. I think just following on from what Dr. Sima has said, in technology, we have this thing where we say it's garbage in, garbage out. You can see that she has clearly outlined that a lot of the problems were even before the technology was involved. It was about, the people registration, the process of that registration. When we're talking about the, manual versus the digital list, even before the main transmission technology is involved, there were issues there, and we could see that the issues. Full disclosure is that in addition to OT Morpho, my company Data Science Limited actually provided part of the transmission system. If you access Form 34A, 34C, we are the ones who developed that system. So the forms.iabc.or.ke, and we have all the records showing from our servers, for example, that everything moved and very smoothly. But then another thing that we say in technology is sometimes the problem is between the keyboard and the chair. So when you think about it, you saw somewhere in the north east constituency, someone actually scanned a page of an exercise book with a camel or some animal drawn on it. That is a person problem. That's a people problem. It's not a technology problem. But then to a lot of people, that becomes a technology problem because it's the technology that has been used to transmit, this. So these are some of the things that we really need to look at. Another, thing that Dr. Sima talked about is, what the lawyers say that the people in France were asleep. I will tell you on our part, we were on 24 hours through the clock. At any given point, when the commissioners were at Bomas giving results, I was in touch, with Mr. Chiloba. I was in touch with his technical teams. At every single hour of the day and the night, we were available for this. So I would personally like to say that was, a lazy excuse from the lawyers, that if you have people in France, people have day and night shifts, really, that should not be an issue. But then coming back to the issue of technology, we have seen how different countries around the world carry out elections and how the types of technologies that they use. Estonia is known as the most digital country in the world, but you have seen that they have had electoral system issues. The United States, just last year, we all experienced, and I'm sure a lot of these petitions are still in court. And these are the countries that, have produced the Silicon Valley of the world. They have issues. So one, why would we think that our systems can be 100%? I will tell you, as a provider to the IEBC during the last two elections, there are points, our graph did not all go up like that. There were points where there was too much traffic and it would go down, and we would just increase our server capacity and it would go up. And as at a point we had almost 100 million access points to the site. In the first election, it wasn't so heavy because we had the digital transmission, but in the second election, after the court ruling, the platform that we developed became the main result, transmission system, and we had tens of millions of people accessing this from all over the world. So this is to say that the expectation that technology will work seamlessly is a dream. Really, it cannot be the reality. And I think now maybe we would be more understanding in this age of digital meetings and seeing how, fluctuations of internet, fluctuations of electricity and things like those, and the kinds of things that are to be expected when it comes to running of the elections. But I think the biggest problem is really not the technology, but the politics that goes on with the idea of elections. in 2019, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics carried out the first ever digital census in the country. In my work, working with various national statistical offices in Africa, I'm always recommending conversations between the NSOs and the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, pushing them to start using more digital methods for census, collections. But why did no one, go to the streets and say the census was rigged or that it did not work? Because I can tell you, it wasn't 100%, efficient and effective. There must have been glitches. There was a lot of campaigns, online of don't give this kind of information, and these guys are asking for this. I was personally interviewed, and I was able to opt out of some questions that I felt, were really infringing on my data rights and data protection. But that's another conversation. So this is me saying that it's not really about the use of technology. It's about the politics around the concept. Before, when there were censuses and some communities were reported to be more than others, you would always see, some petitions of, these results cannot be right because how can this community suddenly have increased by this number? Until you meet those communities, then you're like, oh, okay, now that makes sense. But when it comes to elections, where it is one person winning resources versus another one losing, as we think that elections are, then it becomes even a lot more controversial. And I think that is where the problem really is. And a lot of what needs to happen is civic education on how these systems work and the expectation that these systems can fail, and they would fail. Twitter is famous for giving us fail whales. And it's not just Twitter, M-Pesa that runs our economy somehow sometimes has an outage for hours, and the CBK has to be involved. So this is to say, if Twitter that has billions of dollars in investments and M-Pesa that runs the economy can fail, that expectation for a system that works over a week to be 100% there is really not possible. The question is, how do we mitigate around some of these things? When we're talking about security, and we've mentioned, of course, the unfortunate case of the late Mr. Msando, my understanding through that process is that no one person had access to all the passwords of, running the commission's work. That at the point, I think Chris was acting ICT director. I think the other guy was on leave also, but then that he did not have all the access points. This was distributed all the way from the chairman to the CEO, to himself, to a few other people, and that is basically how you create secure systems. When you think about, logging into your online banking system, you would always have this thing they call two-factor authentication, where once you go in, they tell you we've sent you an OTP to your, one-time password to your SMS or to your phone. Please enter that number. That is a two-factor authentication. So a hacker cannot, for example, just go in without without you being notified. So I personally would say, and in trying to be as objective as possible, that I believe through that process and through the process that we were involved in, there were a lot of things that were done right for that, in the use of technology for elections. And there were a lot of things that could have been done better. And, one of those things is in doing dry runs, for example, which I don't think were done very well before. For example, I'll tell you the second election, where we knew that we were going to do the work, we did not get confirmation until about 3 weeks to the election. So we had to develop systems, and fortunately, I can confidently say that we knew what we were doing at that time. And we have all the logs, and these logs were provided, to the commission, to the courts, to show that our systems did not fail. But just imagine developing a system that is going to run an election in 3 weeks. We're lucky at that time that things worked out, but that really should never be the case. There were some situations where, you know, we opted out of some requests because we said it was simply not enough time. And I personally made the case and told, you know, the commission, unless we had about 4 months to do the testing of some of these systems, we would not get involved. So in the life cycle of software development, there is a critical phase that is called system testing. And that system testing must happen before systems go live. And testing sometimes is not just for bugs and errors, it's also for how does this system, simulating how the system will, for example, handle traffic. If you have 10,000 people versus suddenly having 1 million people accessing a system and you've not developed it for scale, there is going to be a problem because then it's simply going to crash. So these are some of those things, simulations that really needed to happen. As I've said, in most cases, we were lucky that a lot of things worked out well. There is one final thing that I would say is we simply have this culture of doing things very last minute, which is unfortunate, and which, to Dr. Sima's point, sometimes does not allow you to be ready in terms of communication. So if something fails, you are struggling to try and put it together instead of knowing exactly why it has failed and how to communicate and manage the expectations of those involved. So just very finally, for me to say, technology is really how you treat it and how ready you are in using it. And if you put, you know, bad data in, it's simply going to give you bad results. Thank you.
Wow, very good insights there, Lynette. Quick one. I think now you've mentioned the first ever digital statistics done by the Kenya National Bureau of Standards. Bureau of Statistics, and we have seen also the Huduma number process being undertaken. We saw the census that was undertaken also. Do you think like this is really going to help us in any way to ensure that that electoral system is secure and dependable?
As I said, you could develop the best technology in the world, but if you do not sensitize the people about its use and the expectation of its outcome, really, it will not work. You know, you've mentioned the Huduma number process. That process, you know, there was enough resourcing made towards it. There was enough time given, you know, threats and all notwithstanding. And we saw that in terms of the definition of that success, those systems were successful because those organizations, the organizations that were involved in that process defined what success is. So I think one of the things we need to talk about is what is a successful election or electoral process system? What does it look like? Is it, and I believe, was it Judge Jokindungu that asked, is it, you know, when it's 80%? Is it when it's 50%? Is it when it's 100%? We need to define success, because unless you define success, to some people, unless it's 100%, it's a failure. It's, you know, there are people who operate in zeros and ones, not just technologists. There are people who, it's not 100, it's a failure, or it's, you know, it's 98 is okay. My personal mantra is 84 is a straight A. Why get 100? You know, so those are some of the things that, you know, we have to really think about. What is a successful system? So I think there are a lot of things that can be done better from, you know, what we had in 2017 in both August and October. I think that part of that process is, if you ask me, we should have a system today that is undergoing testing. So I know that procurement for KIMS just ended. Hopefully it doesn't take another 6 months, because then we're going to be in 2022, and then we're expecting to have an election in 8 months. Then we're going to be back in, you know, this process. My expectation, if it was up to me, would be that today, here now, there should be a system that is already being tested. There should be simulations already happening. There should be dry runs already happening. By December of 2021, that process should be closed. It should be put back on the shelf and someone saying, okay, see you in June. June, dust it off and say, okay, let's see, does it still work? Yes, let's wait for election day. But waiting till the last minute, that simply doesn't work. And then finally, there has to be great communication to the public. When you think about Huduma number, if you ask the old people, I say I did it for science, and I went in through the process, just talking to the people on the queue, just finding out, where did you come? And to the older folks, they were told, if you do not register, you're simply not going to get government services. To them, there's pension, there's school fees, there's all these things that are involved. So it's about how do you communicate to the public about those systems. So a great technological system in itself is really zero. You have to incorporate all the other aspects, just like change management. There are people involved. You have to bring those people or stakeholders on board as well. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Just before we go to the next session, I just want to remind our participants to give comments, to call in. You can raise your hand on our social media, or you can comment on our social media platforms at ICJ Kenya and at Facebook at kenyasection.icj. Before we go to the next session, quick one, I would like to bring Sima back to on point. Sima, having heard what Lynette has presented, quickly, can you just in one or two statements, do you think that it is actually possible for us to achieve a dependable and secure IT and ICT system?
Yes, absolutely. I think Lynette is absolutely right that we need to set the bounds of what we consider to be successful. But I think if we can demonstrate that we are in control of our own systems and that we have the proper checks in place to prevent, interference or prevent malfeasance, I think that's the best you can do. Of course, there will always be, a way to, I guess if you're a sophisticated hacker, a way to infiltrate the digital systems, right? There could always be a way, but if you show the public that you're aware of that and you've set up mechanisms to protect your system, then I think, you're more than halfway there.
Great to hear that both of you, what you're saying is that it's not really a tech problem. It's a will problem. It's a political problem. It's a person problem. So we really need to put a lot of effort in terms of ensuring, asking ourselves what we really want out of this system. I'll let my co-moderator take us through the next session, Santana.
I will now shift the focus from Kenya and look at the region, Africa. In Africa, we have numerous treaties which address the organization and management of elections. I'd particularly like to draw attention to Article 27, Sub-Article 7 of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which urges state parties to develop and utilize information and communication technologies in advancing political, economic, and social governance. Like I mentioned before, the COVID-19 pandemic will give many African countries, including Kenya, the impetus to enhance the use of electoral technologies. Like in 2021 and 2020, we'll have several African countries that will conduct elections, Kenya being one of them in 2022. So I'd like to enhance our discussions by bringing in Dixon Omondi. Dixon, what are the emerging global and regional trends on elections and technology?
Thank you very much, Santana, and indeed to Dr. Sima and Lynette, who I think have both discussed fairly eloquently and in an expert manner some of the broader but also specific contextual issues around election technology. And I'm going to hit on some of those messages because I think they are still very relevant to the discussion with respect to regional trends and global trends. I think my first point really is to think about election in the broader political, social, and cultural context of human life and interactions, in the sense that we've seen quite a marked shift in the last several decades in terms of how technology is being applied across all sectors. Many years back, probably in 1992, when we had the first multi-party election in Kenya, many of us on this particular call did not know that somebody could own a cell phone, walk around with a cell phone, and be able to share data in real time from a cell phone in a location somewhere in Siaya to Nairobi. That has radically changed now. Nearly every other person in Kenya has some form of gadget that they can use to be able to communicate. And so this really defines the context within which election takes place, that technology is improving. We were talking about 2G technology, 3G technology. We are now talking about 5G technology, which is going to change things quite a little bit in terms of speed and so on and so forth. We are talking about artificial intelligence, for example, the ability to devolve quite a number of functions that will normally be done by human beings to machines. So this really is the overall context in which you have to think about technology, that as society progresses, there is going to be an increasing pressure for us to apply technology, even within the specific subset of our interactions around elections. There is going to be a lot of pressure for election administrators to also adopt technology. And we're seeing that not just in Africa, but also in other parts of the world. We are seeing, and the context of the discussion today is really focusing on election management, but there are others as well who are using technology in the context of elections. So I just came back in December last year from witnessing elections in Ghana, and the two major parties there set up fairly elaborate technological endeavors to track and report and analyze on the elections themselves. So while the Election Commission of Ghana was grappling with problems within their system, both the NDC and NPP knew what the electoral outcomes look like for them. So this puts greater pressure on election management bodies to be able to use technology. Civil society as well. There are places where civil society has played a very important role in digitization of election records, in trying to look at those particular polling station return forms, for example, that Lynette was referring to, and trying to analyze them and see whether they match what the Election Commission is really putting out there. So in a sense, my argument that I'm trying to make is that we cannot run away from the subject of technology, because it's the order of how we are interacting, it's the order of how we are doing business. And so the question comes, and I think this has been handled by both presenters before me, what use is this technology? I think we always talk about the ability of technology or the possibilities of technology to improve on speed, on efficiency, on reliability, on accuracy, and to also help address some of the fraud issues that are involved in election. So as we discuss this, I think it's important to also keep those in mind, that as we talk about fail-safe systems, as we talk about backup to technology, that there is actually a value proposition why people are saying we're embracing technology. So we have to be able to see how technology helps us improve, and not always accepting the fact that technology will fail, that technology will not be sufficient. Yes, it's acceptable that there will always be challenges. It is a fact that there will always be challenges in technology, but to what extent is technology working, first of all, in the manner in which we want it to work, so that when we are addressing those particular challenges, those are not really the key of how the system is working. And then I think the other broad question I want to tackle before I go into some of the specific trends is the question of whether technology really replaces humans. And Lynette has talked about it in the context of garbage in, garbage out. I'd like to add another dimension, really, that technology cannot replace the trust that is required in a system that is resident in humans. That if you don't trust yourself as humans who are involved in the election, if you don't have confidence in each other and your intentions, then technology is not going to solve that problem. If I go further down the plane, that if humans seek to manipulate that particular process using technology, technology itself will not address that. And so some of these issues we are discussing, therefore, are broader than technology itself, go back to just the fact that these are human endeavors and come with the territory of all things that are good and bad about human beings. And then lastly, before I then shift, is that while technology itself, and particularly in the context of Africa, and even in the US and in Estonia, in India, can bring about efficiency, speed, reliability, accuracy. They also do bring about a significant measure of opaqueness. That things that were previously simple are visible to the naked eye. For instance, if we were to count votes today here and it's a paper system, I can clearly see that Mr. X has won 3 because I can see 3 votes in their favor versus Ms. Y with 2 votes in their favor. If that was being counted by a machine, it takes a different type of skill set. It takes a different kind of capacity to be able to have visibility of what is going on. And that has become quite a major issue, particularly when we talk about the context of things like results transmission systems, and require quite a significant sort of change in how we approach election, both in terms of election administrators, but also those who are involved in watching the process to see how it works, to see whether it is being manipulated, to see what problems are inherent in it. So I think that sort of, if you look across the world, they are the extremes really. But you have countries which are sort of on the cusp of adopting technology. You have countries on the other end, Estonia, India, which have gone not only to internet voting, but to fairly sophisticated aspects of technology running all parts of the system. In Africa, there is sort of a sense that we might not be fully ready to fully go and automate our electoral systems, which I agree with for many of the problems outlined here and issues outlined here. But we've seen quite a significant uptick of biometric technologies, certainly with respect to registration of voters, certainly with respect to identification and verification of voters. About half or more of African countries, more than half of African countries now, use some form of biometric voter registration systems, which are electronic to conduct their elections. Now, we are seeing that while they're adopting this technology, again, this technology does not replace any human-induced challenges in elections. So biometric technologies have been really propositioned as being able to, one, address the issue of multiplicity of records, multiple registration, as Seema talked. The idea they discussed, the idea really is how are we able to clean a register so that one voter does not appear 7 times in the register. And biometric technologies, because of that unique identifier, whether it's fingerprint, whether it's optical retina, and so on and so forth, has been positioned as some of those sort of technologies that can address this. There are several issues here. One, that if the system is not set properly, it will not address that problem. And there are many issues here. There is the possibility, for example, that the system will be set in terms, in simple layman terms, not to be able to correctly identify matches. So it will miss matches. It might be set up so that it's catching matches which are not really matches, false matches. But more importantly for me, if there is no strong effort to remove multiple records that have been identified by the biometric systems, then the system will remain as problematic as it were. The records will stay there. So the technology is there, but you're not applying it, you're not using it. In Malawi and Zambia, I think you mentioned Malawi, one of the panelists mentioned Malawi, questions around disparities in voter registration rates cannot be solved by biometric voter registration. Because again, those are products of decisions made by those who are running the election. How do we deploy the infrastructure that we have, the machines that we have? And so if you decide to deploy in certain areas more than others, if you decide to educate voters in certain regions more than others, if you decide to deploy more election officials in certain regions more than others, the problems you have around elections will not be solved by the fact that you have this technology called biometric voter registration. So that's really where I've seen a lot of uptake for technology across the region. Results transmission system is another area, and that area has been a bit problematic, not just in the context of Kenya, but in a number of contexts. And the issues underlying that one, of course, is First, the fact that there is still a lot of questions around trust. Particularly when we do not see what is going on the back end of those systems. How do we trust those particular systems? There are those countries and that still worry about the security of such systems. Will we be hacked? Are there others who will be able to have access to the system and manipulate the system? And as you probably know, this is not just an African problem. This is partly the debate in the United States and other places when you hear about Russian interference and hacking and so on and so forth. So in the context of Kenya, I think that we've had challenges in the last several elections with the results transmission system. And it's worth reflecting on some of the issues that the speakers before me have emphasized. For me, I think, one, how those systems are developed is important, and that is applicable anywhere in the world. Are they implemented in a manner that is inclusive, that all electoral stakeholders really know what is happening and how the system is designed and how it is working? There is the counter argument that allowing people access to be able to see this in itself will contribute to insecurity of the system. I don't think that argument holds, and there are ways that can be addressed. The key point for me, I think, is how do you have a system that is developed in a fairly inclusive manner? And then the questions around testing are very important, and Lynette has discussed some of those issues, when you pilot them versus when you scale up the system. End-to-end testing. How do we make sure that we are able to tell the system will work way before election, right from the point where there was voter registration, if that is integrated into the results transmission system and into the portal and the sort of back front end that you see the website? How does all that work? And how do we make sure that all the key electoral stakeholders know and have access to how that works way before the election? Load testing, we've been told that, when the traffic has increased, that is why the system is failing. So how do we make sure, because we know that there's going to be increased traffic anyway on election day, how do we prepare for that? And then in the context of Kenya and Estonia and other countries, around the worry of cybersecurity, penetration tests. There are countries which approach this in a fairly appropriate manner, which is open up the system to be tested so that people can be sure that the right security features are built in. Because if you don't do that, you will never know what sort of vulnerabilities are there and which might be exploited. So I think in the context of results transmission, those are very important. But one of the points that others have discussed is how then we build in transparency to the system. And one of the movements that we are seeing is around open data principles, that all bodies, most government bodies, and this will be particularly important for elections for election management bodies in the context of technology, should be doing more to provide access to data in fairly simplified, accessible points. And as Dr. Sima said, at the lowest units possible. One wants to see polling station data and have access to it. And why does one want to see polling station data? Because that's really what you can verify as a human being. In the last election, I told a colleague of mine that, I will test the election by going to particular polling stations and then going to the portal to see whether what I saw in that particular polling station is what reflects in the Iabc portal. And that's important because I cannot tell whether what reflects in the Iabc portal for a session I was not in is accurate or not. So to build confidence, really, open data principles are very important. And it's something that I hope that, election commissions across the region and across Kenya, and in Kenya in particular, can embrace. So broadly, I think that the human element is something that we are seeing is still problematic in elections, even as we adopt technology. If we don't address those particular issues, we should not expect technology to address those issues. But in the context of the challenges, therefore, audit and paper trails remain very important. The ability to be able to go back and verify this is what happened. If you go back all the way to probably the US election in 2000, Florida 2000, and the problems that came as a result of that, and then the legal reform process that was, the Help America Vote Act, a strong emphasis on paper and audit trails. We saw that in the last election in the US as well. So the ability, therefore, in my view, to be able to, for example, provide all the polling station return forms, the digital copies of those for all the 40,000, 35,000, whatever the universe of polling stations is very important. The ability for people to be able to access those, to be able to then compare to what they saw is very important. And then maybe let me just conclude at this particular point by saying that the information space around election has also shifted radically because of decentralization of communications, because everybody has technology. One of the new phenomena we are therefore seeing is that everybody becomes an expert around election day with little bits pieces of information. You know, if you look at websites, you will see people sharing again and again copies and pictures of polling station return forms. So this all put greater pressure on those who are running elections to be able to do a better job, but also manage that information space in the context of disinformation, misinformation, but to do so in a manner that also upholds the right to information. So you see the extreme end of that, of course, is Twitter bans, sort of throttling social media and so on and so forth. I think that should not be the way to go. The way to go really should be, how do you provide and preempt this by making sure that you are upfront with providing data in a timely manner, in formats that people can quickly access, easily analyze, and be able to come to their own conclusions. So the place of Kenya really, I think, is, in my view, to see how we can improve on technology so that we don't start from the perspective that technology will fail. Yes, we know technology will fail, but how can we improve on its accuracy? How can we improve on how it works and performs? How can we improve on its reliability? And all these are questions around investment, questions around looking at the humans around this, and so on and so forth, even as we try to think about fail-safe mechanisms that will help us when technology fails. So I'll stop there for now, and happy to discuss questions as they come.
Thank you, Dixon. You've mentioned something very important, that technology does not replace any human-induced challenges. And in the context of Kenya, how do you think, knowing our society and the lack of honesty, how do you think this can be solved?
I'll be very curious to see whether any of the panelists has an answer to how we can solve the honesty question, not just in Kenya, but across the world. And you know, it's interesting because one of the things that I'd argued before is, if you allow people access, if you allow people to be able to see all parts of the system, maybe they will make the right decisions about how to relate to the results, how to relate to the outcomes of the process, either by saying, I know I won fairly, I know I lost fairly. But, you know, a good friend of mine told me, and, you know, again, I was in Ghana, that regardless of what you see and whether you collect the numbers yourself, the human instinct is to always claim, I won, even though we know I failed. You know, or the human instinct is to see that, oh, I'm failing, let me therefore manipulate the system so that I win. So it's a loaded question that you've asked, really. But it's a question that, you know, goes back to the idea of why do we have laws? Why do we try to build in systems? It's because we cannot rely on that trust aspect alone. It's because we are trying to make sure that humans are held accountable based on certain standards, based on certain processes.
Thank you. We'd now like to hear from Francis, and I'd like to remind the participants that you can share your questions in the chat section, and you can also raise your hand using the hand icon. You will see it on the Zoom application. So we'd like to hear from Francis now. He was formerly a legal expert at the Kriegler Commission. I know that's very fresh in our minds after the 2007 election. One of the main recommendations from the Kriegler Commission was the use of technology to avoid manipulation of the process. So, Francis, as a former member of the Commission, what challenges do we expect in electoral dispute resolution within the COVID-19 pandemic? Over to you, Francis. Please unmute your microphone, Francis?
Thank you, Santana. I believe I'll just answer the questions that you have for me in quick succession, even though you've only asked one. But let me begin with the one that you have asked. Of course, before I do that, let me also agree with colleagues who have spoken before on the fact that the use of technology in elections is something we can't run away from. And that we are just going to have to improve how we use technology rather than whether we can put technology aside and work with something else. Most people don't realize that we've actually used technology in elections in this country for a long time. We've used it in other spheres for a long time. Long before Iabc began to use optical character recognition for voter registration, our exams had been marked by the Kenya National Examination using the same technology. So really, we have no choice but to improve, like many of the speakers before me have said. But let me first tackle the issue of dispute resolution within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we all know that just as COVID-19 has complicated many spheres of our lives, it will also, has also complicated elections and election dispute resolution. And I'm seeing dispute resolution writ large to include political parties because they do have some internal dispute resolution mandate. I'm seeing that at Iabc, especially with regard to the disputes that come from the nominations, the political parties dispute tribunal, and of course the courts. It's reassuring, though, because this pandemic has been with us since November of 2019 on the African continent, several months later, March or thereabouts, that we now have enough experience with the pandemic to think about how things might be when we have our next general elections, hopefully next year. And Kenya is amongst a number of African countries that have also held elections during the pandemic. For Kenya, of course, it's been the string of by-elections that we've had, including the ones we had last month. So we do have some experience with this, and we do have some experience also with how dispute resolution has moved in the course of the pandemic. On this end, even though initially there was quite some disruption, the courts were closed, we have seen courts actually find ways of operating despite the pandemic, and 2022 should be no different. However, this is life as we know it. I can anticipate some challenges. Those challenges will depend, of course, on the severity of the pandemic. Whether we'll be having our nth wave by the time we have those elections, and what exactly they will do in terms of affecting how we handle our dispute resolution is in certain respects a matter of conjecture, but there are also things that we've seen before, and therefore we can expect to see them. On the technological side, I dare hope that we will not choose technology in a way that brings some of the risks that Dixon mentioned. If we go the way of electronic voting, for instance, especially considering the challenges we've had with just the little amount of technology we've brought into our elections, there will be problems, partly because some of these systems, and I think Dixon alluded to that, don't leave an audit trail, and yet you need evidence in order to pursue the resolution of the dispute to its logical conclusion. That's why I'm actually hoping that we will stay at the level that we are with KIMS, perfect our use of that before we begin venturing into other areas. Secondly, we will, especially if we remain with that level of technological investment, be using paper-based ballots. As you know, the pandemic has come with concerns over handling, amongst other things, paper. At some point, you remember us being encouraged to actually use M-Pesa and other non-paper-based payment systems. So these concerns would apply to ballots as well. And therefore, there will be the question of how do you verify things in a system where there are health concerns around handling paper. And I think that's one of the things that we've got to bear in mind, especially because if the dispute comes down to whether so-and-so actually got the votes that were declared, and I dare say even some of the polling station evidence can be challenged on that account, typically then the people who are challenging it are entitled to a recount. And how do you recount while you are worried about the risk of catching COVID? That's a concern. The third is something that happens long before polling day, which is basically obeying the political rights of those who are participating in elections. You've seen in places further afield that elections are rigged long before polling day by, amongst others, constraining the ability of people to campaign. I'm sure you saw bits and pieces of that in the just concluded by-elections in Georgia, for instance. How do you draw the line between somebody being arrested for not obeying pandemic control measures vis-a-vis being allowed to campaign because that necessarily involves interacting with people? And that question is not just a rhetorical question as it is now, because Georgia was eventually taken by the people whose rights were being constrained in this manner. It may well come to pass that an election in future is contested because there was a clash between pandemic control measures and observing people's political rights. That's something that I'm hoping we will be able to strike a balance around. There were a lot of concerns in Malawi, for instance, because they were holding their elections at a time when actually the pandemic was in full swing. The approach they took was they threw the COVID rule book out the window and did what they had to do. On this end, things might be different, or we might want to follow that same script. But you want to run things in such a way that this does not become a ground for a successful election petition challenge. The other, which goes to the courts generally and how the pandemic has affected how they operate, is we are now going virtual. So you can see a future of virtual complaints before these other bodies, as well as virtual petition hearings. How does that happen in a way that answers to some of the challenges we have, including what I dare say are outdated evidence laws? For many people out here, a photo is a photo. So for instance, if I go to a polling station, and Dixon was right when he said that's where the credibility and verifiability of elections rests, because as many of you will remember, the results at the polling station are not just supposed to be counted and declared. They are supposed to be pasted in a public place within the polling station where anybody can see that these were the results of this polling station. And therefore, in today's era where everybody, literally everybody has a smartphone, anybody who sees those results then can take an image. You can expect long arguments in court about whether that photo taken by somebody's smartphone is admissible in evidence or not. The other thing is also, and this again will be in instances where you have to secure witnesses, securing them to appear physically is usually enough of a challenge. Securing them to appear virtually just adds to that. And it's some of what I think will come into play as well. And then lastly, for me, before the matters then proceed to hearing in some form or shape, the question of process service. So I do hope that the courts will follow the expansive view of the Constitution, where you have options that therefore are not limited by the fact that you've got a pandemic in full swing, because again, this can become a constraint to dispute resolution. That's where I would like to stop with that particular question, and then on to the question of politics and how to make sure that we've got a conducive political environment for the application of technology. Again, some of the things that colleagues said are very important, but a few things before I come to my recommendations in this regard. The fact remains that in many of the cases, and I think Lynette said this, Dixon agreed with it, that if you look at our experience with technology in elections in Kenya, it is not the technology that failed us. It is the humans that failed us. And until we find ways to either completely solve the problems that are wrought by those humans, or until we get to the point where we can at least minimize them or prove that the humans actually did something wrong, we will continue to have those challenges. And I think the future is bright. Elections are not the only field in which we have used technology. My usual example is the banking system. If some of you like me didn't trust ATMs when they first arrived in this country, you made sure you kept those slips from the ATM and you checked those against your bank statement. We've now come to the point where those slips literally litter the environment around the ATM machine, because people have realized you don't need to carry the slip home. They have gotten to this point where they trust the banking system, that even if you are depositing cash using an ATM machine, what you get on the statement will be equal to what is in your account. And if you have some doubt, that those doubts will actually be resolved because the system has been built to the level where it can actually catch anything that humans are trying to do, including fraud. And I think we will get to that point with our elections as well. It's an important thing for everybody to understand as an election stakeholder, because we don't want to leave politics to politicians alone. So our politicians have to do their bit, understanding the nature of technology and how it applies in this environment. But we as citizens and all the other stakeholders, including IEBC, we'll also have to wrap our minds about this and then do our best to improve how we apply it and how we move forward. If somebody forgets to charge a battery for a mobile device, it is the human who has failed, not the technology. Yeah. The other thing that I think is important to state before I come to the recommendations is technology is merely a means to an end. And that end is in our Constitution, that we have elections that are simple, that are accurate, that are verifiable, secure, accountable, and transparent. And we are merely using technology to help us get to that end. And that's important for everybody in this sphere to remember as well. Having said that, what then are some of the things that we might want to pay regard to so that we find it easier, better to apply technology in elections? The first is political parties as primary stakeholders need to play a constructive role. In the Kriegler report, one of the damning findings we made was that the environment leading to the elections had been irretrievably polluted and contributed in large measure to some of the things that then happened. Why is this the case? If you cry wolf without good reason, you're polluting the environment. On the other hand, you have to be on your guard and to actually spot the wolf so that hopefully you are crying wolf when you've actually seen a wolf. And this is something our politicians don't always do very well. Courtesy of Cambridge Analytica, we were fed with all manner of things that polluted our view of what 2013 was going to be like, both the actors as well as the technology. But on the other side, you also had a lot of wild claims that were unproven. So everybody, not just the politicians, but this responsibility is largely on the political parties because they are the primary stakeholders. They are the ones competing for power. They need to understand that. I don't know how many people remember that Iabc passed an election, an elections technology regulations that were actually adopted by Parliament in 2017, in which many of the things that we are discussing now had actually been provided for. Whether they actually did their work in accordance with that piece of law is something for debate, but it included, curiously, an elections and technology advisory committee in which political parties were represented. I'm not sure that many people even saw what that committee did. Yet, these are some of the devices that have been created to make sure that matters as sensitive as how technology is going to be applied in an election in ways that build trust in the process are discussed, are agreed, and are followed through. I don't think that happens. So moving forward, it might be a good thing to make sure that happens because it's one of the devices that is there for political parties to actually play a constructive role in the process, in addition to their other roles elsewhere in the process. Observers, because it's dangerous to leave politics to politicians, should also focus on the typical areas of weakness and be ready to provide evidence of malpractice. I have spent some time in recent days actually saying we need to move from the belief that observers have had heretofore, that if you are in court presenting evidence about how things happened in a particular polling station, that you are there for partisan. You are actually helping the cause of justice by merely stating what you saw. Whether the court believes you and the decision the court will make, leave that to the courts. So going back again to the message that the polling station is where most of this gravitates in terms of verifiability, I was quite surprised that in a number of conversations with colleagues who had been observing elections, not enough attention was paid to collecting these evidence because we can all argue about whether a server was hacked and so on and whether those results are visible, or we can actually put something on the table and say, look, this is what was declared at a particular polling station. And obviously, because this is about whether the evidence is solid enough to affect the decision of the court, whether that's what happened in a certain number of polling stations. And when we now look at the revised figures, we can actually see that it is so and so instead who was the winner. Next, of course, and which I have mentioned in responding to dispute resolution and taking into account the pandemic, is it is also going to pollute the environment if we are going to use the pandemic as an excuse to restrict political and electoral rights. And this you can see openly when sometimes somebody who is trying to meet 500 people is prevented from meeting those people. And yet somebody else is meeting hundreds of thousands. I mean, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So one of the principles around applying the law fairly is that you must treat everybody equally using the law. We are all equal before the law. So if as a matter of pandemic control, meetings are not allowed, they shouldn't be allowed for everybody. Yeah. On the other hand, if you're going to allow them, you can't cherry pick who can have a meeting and who can't, because emotions are bound to fly to get raised around an issue like that. The next thing that I put on the table is we need to resist the penchant to change laws too close to an election. I know that in the build up to this session, BBI was mentioned, but BBI is not the only risk. Our politicians have traditionally had this penchant for changing laws close to the elections. And IEBC has put up that severally as something that just complicates their plans. Some of the things that Lynette was talking about, that you test on a system long before the election, can actually be unraveled by changes in the law, depending on how those actually change electoral processes as we know them. And I think it's good to agree that, in my view, 6 months before an election, we shouldn't be tinkering with the law still, yet we tend to still do that. Our risk management strategies should also include the additional challenges that have been brought on by COVID-19. So somebody said we are last minuters. Let us not act next year as if we haven't been aware that COVID-19 is around. So the more we integrate COVID-19 in our risk management measures, the more we will deal also with some of the political process problems that arise in the process. It's been mentioned before, and I completely agree that transparency is key. Our constitution requires elections to be verifiable. You're not going to be able to verify them if you are not transparent. So I'm looking forward to a future where IEBC does two things. Number one, it balances safeguarding technology with confidence building. Let's deal with this opaqueness that Dixon was talking about. If you shine light on any process, you reduce the number of contestations around it. There will probably be contestations because humans are humans, but you certainly reduce them. And even when they are there, you certainly then can verify what is the contention that has weight and which contention doesn't have weight. Second thing that IEBC should do along this line is to fully submit to the scrutiny of the courts regarding the integrity of its systems. Ours is a system in which IEBC has got the cardinal responsibility to deliver on clean elections, but it is also a system that is supervised by the courts. So you cannot be in court saying we can't open the servers because so-and-so is asleep. Thank you, Lynette. But I'm also hoping that no other excuses will be availed to putting all this material before court so that courts can make the final pronouncement on them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. You've given us some very many important points. And you've thrown a spanner in the works that observers can actually play a role in providing evidence in courts. And this will avoid instances like we had in 2017, where the court ordered that the servers are open and they were never opened eventually to this date. You also mentioned about political parties, the need for political parties to play a constructive role. So I'd like to ask you, what challenges do you think the party primaries would face in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? What sort of disputes do you think would come up from the party primaries?
You're asking my imagination to run wild. I should have said that some of the things I've put on the table will depend on how severe the pandemic is. So if party primaries are going to be held in a period when medically, from the standpoint of pandemic control, people cannot gather, it means that people are going to find other ways of doing so. And we're going to therefore find other ways of verifying if what should have happened is actually what happened. And we've seen this, for instance, when votes are being taken in the legislature over a bill or a motion. It's very important that you keep records of how that process went, who was here physically, if it's blended, and who was there virtually, and how did people vote? Because at the end of the day, it comes down to verification. So the same standards we have for IEBC are the same standards we should have for the political parties. And maybe it's a blessing in disguise. Dixon, who has worked with political parties for more years than I have, knows they hardly have the wherewithal to hold credible party nominations that resemble the manner in which we hold our general elections. Money is very often a problem, but the other thing also is that there's a serious trust deficit. But just thinking about money and logistics, maybe it's a good thing that they be able to do so virtually. How they will do that is something for discussion. I think that a delegate system of some kind would actually be a good thing, but it means also that even that delegate system, they must then have ways of verifying who voted, who did not. I'm hoping that we don't come to this kind of future, because some kind of physical interaction might actually still be a good thing for these things. Because let's forget it, there's a problem with access to technology in this country. So if we are ever driven into a situation where virtual then becomes the medicine for everybody, let's face it, some people's political rights will then not be obeyed. And I hope that we never get to that point, which then means that it's actually a good thing that we wrap our minds around this pandemic control thing to avoid that doomsday scenario. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Francis. I'll now hand over to my co-moderator, Silas.
Thank you so much, Francis. I've picked up some points from you as well. I think one of the most interesting thing is what you've mentioned, that you are foreseeing a scenario where there could be a clash between COVID-19 pandemic rules as well as control mechanisms and the elections. Generally, we understand that elections is a process that requires people to gather. So what are we thinking about that particular area? As we move into the next quick session, just to remind our participants to ask questions. We have one question from Grace. Grace Wanjiku is asking, there's this other side of using technology in terms of ensuring that elections are efficient. But my question is, how can we use technology also to enhance accountability, especially on the area of election offenses? So I would direct that question to any of the panelists, and particularly maybe Francis to answer that, and Dixon quickly. But before they answer, I will just quickly ask the panelists to give us what you think are some of the legislative and policy reforms that you think we should address now ahead of the 2022 general election, so that we are ready regarding tech. What should IBC do next? And just quickly, in a punchy form, I would want to start with Dr. Sima.
Thank you. I would say, first, I just want to pick up on what was said a minute ago about how can we use technology for accountability. I think if the portal had been allowed to operate the way it was intended to operate, it would have done so much for accountability. If in 2014, there was an election in Indonesia and the results were contested, but the Election Commission put all the forms online. And then this network of diaspora youth came together and coordinated basically a check on the forms. So everyone took a certain number of forms, checked them, did the math, pointed out any problems. And there you had public verification of the results in, I think, a matter of days. So I think if you use technology to shine light on all the parts of the election cycle, then there you have built-in accountability, because you have the public able to check what it is you're saying, which is part of the constitutional provision, right? Which says that the public should be able to verify results. Coming to the legislative changes, I think one really important thing that could be done would be to institute a comprehensive results transmission system into the law in a way that makes it clear how the public and third parties can verify results. So consider something like having parallel tracks of digital electronic results and manual electronic results with cross checks that are built into key junctures of the process. so that you don't have muddling. One is actually acting as a check on the other, and it's streamlined and efficient, and it's built into the law. So there's no sort of, well, maybe we'll design it this way or this way. It's in the law, so you have to do it. As part of that, I would say we should also consider having in the law a mechanism that allows for post-election auditing of results that's done alongside civil society, so that whatever audit happens, it can be broken down into understandable parts and understandable language for the public to digest, which is civil society's specialty, right? So if that can be done, I think those two changes would go quite a long way.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sima, for that quick, those two quick points, which I think are very, very critical. I will skip Lynette for now, and I will go to Dixon.
Thank you. I think those are very important questions that have been asked. And I think Dr. Sima has touched on one which I think is very important for me. That shining the light means that we provide access not just to political parties, but also to civil society and other independent groups that want to verify the integrity of the system. And so starting with the polling station return forms on the portal, we tried to scrap as many of those as we could and to analyze those, but certainly we did not get access to all of them. And some of them had problems, the legibility problems, because ultimately people were writing by hand on those particular forms. But it is like the Indonesian case, which I'm very familiar with, reflects one of the ways in which people can try and build independent analysis of what is going on. Because the idea here is, as political contestants who are parties and claim positions, what is the role of independent actors in saying, but this is what we see as well? And I think publishing polling station results form is very important, making sure that there is access to the polling station return forms, Form 34, Form 17, whatever, however you call them from the past, is very, very important. And I hope that is something that the IEBC in Kenya can try work with. And I'm sure that if that is approached well, that need not fail again in the future. Number two, there has been, and Google has been very good in doing this and helping election commissions to do this, providing access via APIs to what is going on the back end. And that can allow political parties, independent observers, and others to have access and be able to see how the numbers and the sort of information is flowing on the back end. That again, I think is a very important aspect of it. Unfortunately, in both 2013 and maybe in 2017, when the system failed, the fact of the existence of these APIs was not very helpful. But more importantly for me, how political parties and civil society prepare themselves to use those. Because if you don't have people with the right skill sets, then whether you are granted access or not will not be helpful. So I think there is a sort of imperative on political parties, on civil society as well, to start thinking about the type of people they need who will have the right training, the right skill sets to be able to get into the system when they're provided access, so that they can be able to verify that thing. That is the opaqueness I was talking about. And that is sort of the counter of it, which is how to build transparency in it. So I think those are very important places where we can make improvements going forward. I certainly think that, broadening the question to what Francis said, which was allowing court scrutiny of the work of the Election Commission. Francis was looking at it probably from a process perspective. And he was coming to it at the point where it comes to dispute resolution. But I do hope that that part of scrutiny can be built way before we ever have to resort to court systems. And the famous example that is given is, I think in 2010, a planned election in the state of Washington, D.C., where they wanted to do internet voting and for absentee voters. And what they did was to ask for the public and anybody who wanted to participate in what is called a penetration test, access the system, try show us if you can manipulate it from outside. This bunch of students with their professor, I think at the University of Michigan, not only got access into the system, they took control of all the cameras where and they were able to see, manipulate, leave the system without being detected. And the only way that they were detected afterwards was twofold. One, they left a sound music in the system so that somebody could hear what's that voice. But because again it was a penetration test, they announced that, look, we had penetrated the system. What does that mean? That means that you give all persons who are involved, stakeholders, the ability to see how the system works, build confidence, and to make decisions differently. In Washington, what they ended up doing is to say, okay, we postpone this part of the election that will take place over internet because we've demonstrated, or it has been demonstrated, that the system is not working. So scrutiny should not be an afterthought, an afterfact. It should be something built in the system through all the tests that Lynette was talking about, user tests, load tests, end-to-end tests, and so on and so forth. And that's very important. And then lastly, I think in the context of offenses, Francis has talked about some of the legal issues that can come out of that. But certainly we've seen a lot of movement in terms of media, civil society, and others looking at these things, sharing them through crowdsourcing techniques, and trying to build some sort of linkage interface with those responsible, the police, for example, in the context of violence, and trying to get people to address those. So I think that's a very important area. It needs a lot of support. There is a lot of robust and sophistication in Kenya in terms of civil society, whether you talk about what is going on at IHAB Research, UMATI, and so on and so forth, that I think can be brought to bear in terms of this process. I'm less enthusiastic on the question about legal reforms because, we are always doing legal reforms. They are important, but I do hope that we can get somewhere as Kenyans, and particularly those who are administering elections, to do the right thing. Because Sima, here is what I find challenging. What is the proper balance between putting all these things in law versus allowing some decisional independence on the part of people who are running elections to be able to, exercise discretion? Now, the whole idea is to control discretion, I know, but to what extent? And so the law must be able, in my view, to contemplate all the major problems and what have been seen in the past. But I do think there is a corresponding duty on the part of those who are implementing these particular laws, in this particular case, election commissioners, to also be doing the right things. A decision to be able to test the system early should not be something that we have to prescribe in law. That's something that anybody who is in the right frame of mind should see the value of. A decision to allow, again, for post-independent audits should not be something, in my view, that has to be prescribed in law. Of course, if it's problematic, as it were, it is. But if one was able to allow for us to see polling station return forms, if one was able to allow us to access all the Form 34As, 34Bs, and whatever they're called, then Dixon can sit in the quiet of his bedroom and independently audit and see this is what happened with the election and share those. And anybody else doing an audit using the same methodology will come to similar conclusions if they are all operating from the same sort of common denominator. So I think for me, legal reform is a very important subject, but we have to ask ourselves the question as people involved in these particular exercises about to what degree are we accountable to those laws that are already there that require us to do certain things. And maybe as a point of reflection, as I hand over, is thinking about how we can try and build in, strengthen that accountability aspect in terms of laws and remedies that are available to people who are dissatisfied with the process. Because oftentimes, what we go to court is to ask for the remedy of overturn the election result. Right. Are there other remedies that can help election officials do the right thing? Sanctioning those, for example, who, if proven, deliberately subvert the system and so on and so forth. So I think those are useful things to ask ourselves of. But I do think that it's important to see technology, as Francis said, as an aid helping us as humans to achieve the goals and objectives of free, fair, transparent, and credible elections.
Right. Thank you so much, Dixon, for that. I assume that some of these recommendations that we are giving in here are not really recommendations for Kenya alone, but rather in most countries across the region. I can see Sima has raised her hand. Sima, do you want to say something before we go to the next panelist?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond quickly. I agree that we should not try and codify every detail in the law, but we also are not, I think, doing ourselves a service by assuming that, as Dixon said, everyone's in the right state of mind. If we could assume that, and that means that we're all thinking the same thing, we would be in a very different place, I think. But we're not. So I think if we reach consensus that something should be our standard against which we measure success or failure, then it's helpful to have that in the law, because then at least you can fall back on the law to say you either did or you didn't perform according to the law. But I think apart from that, the other thing which hasn't come up in the discussion yet is that I don't think we can always assume that using technology on its own comes with greater transparency or more accountability or more efficient processes. I don't think we can assume that technology will always make an election better. I just don't think that's the case. And there have been studies that have shown that there's no empirical evidence to support that either. So I think a lot of us in the public make assumptions about how technology is going to help us deliver a more transparent and credible election, but it's just not the case that it always does. And so I think that going forward, it would be a great thing if the Iabc could think critically about what technology is worth it and what technology maybe doesn't work in the Kenyan context. So I would say, if you can, instead of devoting all the money the way it is right now devoted, think about whether it's more worth it to really invest in, for instance, biometric voter registration, because that happens over a longer period of time. It's had more success around the world. And because you have that time span, you have time to address things as they come up and fix them. And if you can take money away from electronic results transmission and invest it into biometric voter registration, for instance, maybe then you'd be starting off with a more credible register, and you can leave the results transmission in paper form. And we've seen it in so many more what are called advanced democracies. Right. They're going back to paper, right? Because as someone said earlier, it's much easier to verify a form that you can see in front of you, right? That's much easier to deal with. And so that's what I would say, that there should be critical self-reflection about whether technology is useful in all the ways it's currently being used or not.
Right, Dr. Sima. Dixon, if you allow me, please hold that thought and response, as well as Lynette and Francis. If we could move into the quick Q&A section, and then maybe once we've had one or two questions from the participants, you could share your views together with those. Any participants on the line who would want to call in? Is there someone there who would want to ask any question or comment? Over to our participants. All right, we'll keep open to the questions or comments that you have put on Zoom. Quick question to Lynette. Lynette, a participant is asking a quick question to the panelists. How does Kenya perhaps ensure that technology reaches the community down in the rural areas, etc., apart from the urban areas? So, Lynette, could you please share your views in terms of the legislative and policy reforms as you're giving us your response to that question from the participant? Please unmute, Lynette. We can't hear Lynette. All right, perhaps maybe we can move to Francis. Francis, could you share your views as we continue to the wrapping up session? Francis? Lynette, can you hear us now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, go on.
Okay, great. That's better. Great. Yeah, no, I wanted to say first, there's this interesting podcast I listened to that said rigging happens before election day. And Francis, talked about things like Cambridge Analytica, and that's a whole complete big conversation about use of data to convince, and whether that's convincing or rigging. But even before we talk about manipulation of voters, or the systems, there is manipulation that happens way before. And as Dixon said, sometimes, it's very difficult for someone to accept that, yeah, I lost, it did not work out, and, how do I move forward to this? In terms of something very interesting that Francis also said, banking systems. We trust banking systems today. And I'll use this to also answer the question that, you've put forth, Silas. Today, you can send someone money on your M-Pesa, right? Mm-hmm. You can send them 20 shillings, you can send 70,000 shillings. Why is it not possible to use that same type of technology to vote in someone? Because I send money, that process does not fail. If I send you 20 shillings, you receive 20 shillings. You don't receive 30 shillings, you don't receive 10 shillings. What is so difficult? Technology has actually reached the minorities in the rural areas. It is just that we are thinking it should be this very advanced technology. Think about Gambia using marbles, for a presidential election. It works. What is technology? That is technology. It's a means to an end. It's a way of doing a process that is practical, right? So today, that same Kabambe mobile phone that a person in the very rural area uses to receive
an M-Pesa. We seem to have lost Lynette. Lynette, are you there?
Hello? Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
I can still hear you, yes.
Yes, Go on.
Great. So the same, very rudimentary mobile phone that is used by a person in the village to receive M-Pesa is the same technology that can be used by that same person to vote in someone, especially during, now we are heading into, a COVID election, where people, might be worried about coming out and queuing and being in crowds and things like that. So really, let's not think about technology as this very advanced, big monster animal that, we must spend billions of shillings on. There's already technology in the hands of more than 80% of the adult population in this country, and we can definitely use that. Dixon talked about something very interesting in terms of API access. We, for example, when we offered our solution to the commission, were asked to provide our logs. We were asked to open up, our servers for access by, the political parties. Did anyone come knocking and asking for this? No. Did anyone look at the logs that we provided? I do not think so. Why? Just to what you say, Dixon, capacity. Do the political parties have the capacity? Do the civil society organizations have the capacity to actually be able to audit these systems? I do not think that that's the case. But, there was this entire process of people going to court and going through this process to get this success. And when this success was granted, they did not do anything with it because they did not have the capacity to be able to do that. So those are some of the other things that we need to think about. And finally, for me, the legislative changes that should happen, it's pretty much what Francis said. There should be a legislative freeze 6 months, 1 year before an election, that nothing should really come in changing during that time, because you're expecting that that's the time systems should already be in place and they should already be working. I support what Dixon said. You can change all these things, but at the end of the day, if you cannot trust the humans to even implement these things, nothing is really going to work. So for me, let's first of all do a lot of this change management with the humans even before we touch the code. Thanks.
Right. We have a question from one panel participant, Billy Osogo. Are you willing to voice your question, Billy? All right. Yes, Billy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Over to you, Billy.
Thanks. I'd just like to ask our panelists, will the Supreme Court's 2017 decision to annul the elections, partly because IBC couldn't meet the requisite constitutional requirements, and its subsequent failure to comply with the Supreme Court's order to open the service, and taking into view the current Cold War between the state and the judiciary over BBI and the partial appointment of judges, how confident are our panelists about a fair and transparent election in 2022? Thanks.
Very, very good question, Billy Osogo. Thank you so much for that question. I think any other participant who has a question or a comment? All right, none. So I think what we will do, we will go into the next session where my colleague Santana will take through us that question. You panelists will have an opportunity to quickly answer the question for Billy. I think it's great for us to hear from each of the panelists, as well as you can voice your views in terms of what you think legislative and policy reforms we should address. Over to you, Santana.
Thank you, Silas. I'd like to ask all the panelists a question with regards to what role you think all stakeholders, including civil society, can play in ensuring the integrity of electoral systems. And I'd like to begin with Seema.
I think stakeholders are already aware of their roles. I think it's a matter of having the access that they need and the data and information they need to be able to fulfill their roles. So when we talk about also Billy's question about how confident we are about a fair and transparent election, I think that question is, for me, it's up in the air. It depends what we now see. What position will the Iabc take? What preparations is it already making? Has it already made? What are its plans for changes going forward? How, what is it thinking right now in terms of what's possible, what's not possible, and what it expects? I think if we hear from Iabc, it would give us sort of more information to know what's happening and then be in a better position to judge how we feel. But I think, going forward, CSO should continue to be watchdogs. Political parties should continue to be involved in the process as watchdogs, but also as stakeholders with vested interest in how things go. And that also brings me back to a point that Francis made about the committee, the technology committee that the Iabc had in place in 2017, but which was then declared unconstitutional in a court case. I think if that committee could be reconstituted in a constitutional way to include experts on cybersecurity, to include election practitioners that have done this before, to include media and CSO representatives, to keep the decisions of that committee, in the public domain, explain what's happening. I think that could also go a long way in rebuilding trust between the public and the Iabc.
Thank you. Please, could you also tell us about your views on the legislative and policy reforms that need to be addressed ahead of the 2022 general elections? Oh, sorry, Seema, you had already answered that, but for the panelists, I'll now move to Dixon.
Thank you. Let me start with some things that Seema talked about earlier on that I think are very important. She will probably have been part of my concluding remarks, but I'll say them now in case we run out of time. And the first really is what Seema said, that we built so much expectation in previous elections about what technology was going to deliver, and in a sense might have set ourselves up to fail in terms of the benchmarks that were being used to then evaluate how technology performed. When I was much younger, I wanted to work for the Iabc, and I applied for a job there. And since it's a public interview process, one of the questions I was really worried about and spent a lot of time thinking about is, if I'm asked about the role of technology in elections, what will I say? Because my gut feeling was to de-emphasize what the political class, the political parties were propounding as what technology will deliver for that particular election. So it does go back to 2 points. One, which is technology is not a panacea, it will not solve all problems. And secondly, what I think Francis touched on, that we all have a responsibility, including political parties, to set the right context for the elections, including acknowledging that this probably, is what we need to be looking at versus these ideals, aspirations that we might not be able to deliver on. And in that respect, I agree therefore fully that, trying to see ways in which we can improve on the biometric system of voter identification and verification is very important. Trying to make sure that, the voter register is not full of multiple registrants, deduplication processes is very important. But more importantly, because we've seen problems with the results transmission, and I'm very deliberate, I'm not using electronic results transmission, I'm just saying results transmission in elections, it's important to think about what is our benchmark and whether we want to say that we are basing things off first of a paper system, and technology will facilitate that, because that can help us make the right decisions about where to invest our efforts and resources. But I think, if you go back to the US, if you go back to, Estonia and other countries, that's an important part of the debate that we should have. I am an eternal optimist. So, I don't want to think about whether there will be a bad election or not in 2022. I think what we should be doing is to all work together towards a credible, fair election in 2022. And there's been significant improvement over previous elections. If anybody recalls elections before 1992, where, povling took place at a very different location from where counting took place. And we were able to overcome that and the mischief in the movement between the polling and the counting places. And even in the US, if you go back to how the ballots sort of started. So humanity is about progress. And I will not sort of take the view that, we be discouraged about what we've seen in the past, as opposed to finding ways in which we can keep moving forward. Certainly, the framing of that question was important because it highlights the important role of the judiciary. And one of the questions that people who have looked at this particular field have grappled with over time, and without taking a position over whether the court decisions are right or not, is whether election commissions can be held accountable. Because if there's a presumption that their acts are regular and according to law, and that they're right, and yet, you can see from past in history instances where the election commission itself is the problem. How do you then provide remedy, not just for the people who are involved in the process, but for the broader aspirations of systems to live in a democratic society based on free and fair elections? So that's why, for me, an interesting area of study could be, because there's been a lot of furor about the court ruling in 2017, the Malawi ruling, which also overturned the case, and probably not as much. I think there's been 4 or 5 presidential election petitions across the world that have succeeded. So the question about remedies that courts can offer litigants is one that for me is very interesting and needs further research. Ultimately, do you overturn the election? And if you don't and can't overturn the election, what other sort of tools do you have to try encourage people who run elections to keep doing the right thing and to keep moving on the path of progress, forward progress? So I think for me, it's important to preserve that space for the judiciary. It's a very important role they play, not just in the context of election, but in the balance of power and in the idea that, not all men are angels, and therefore, if you allow them to do the business of government, you definitely have to check them and their excesses. And just see that, they're playing an important role, and which I think largely is what the Supreme Court has grappled with in 2017 on this question of forward progress. So there is a recruitment process that is ongoing for the Iabc commissioners. Ultimately, the men and women and the fortitude of the men and women who staff this commission and their decisions and courage also plays a great contributing role. And I do hope that Kenya will get the right set of commissioners to try and lead us to address some of these complex challenges.
Thank you, Francis. Indeed, the judiciary has a very big role to play, but I think maybe the biggest challenge right now is probably the judicial officers. Some may fear the intimidation that some have faced from the executive. I'll now move on to Lynette. Please answer Osogo's question.
Great, thank you. I think for me, the biggest threat really to the upcoming election is, the crippling of both, the Iabc and the judiciary when it comes to resourcing. And we have seen that play out in the past when there's kind of some kind of infighting, and the budget is then slashed, and that means you don't get to do what needs to be done. I try not to be a big optimist sometimes in cases where there's a clear way that things can be done or should not be done. But I think, as Sima said, let us not blindly put all our trust and all our optimism on technology. It's beyond that. There's a lot more that happens around this. And a big part of it is really in terms of the resources that then will be given. And I mean, that's also part of the tactics that will be used, to undermine the independence or even the operations of this institution. So let us figure out how, we can support and how we can do this. And then finally, for me, is to say we really need to get to a point where we are defining success, and where we are defining, what a successful election looks like. With or without technology, my hope is that we will continue to use technology until we get to a point, where we are comfortable, because we cannot run away from these processes. As Dixon has clearly said, from the place where we were at before 1992 to where we are at today, I can very confidently tell you that we, have made very, very positive strides, and we need to keep moving. It's our second, third try. It's difficult to expect that everything will be at 100%. So we really need to define what success for the next election looks like, and check against that, and then improve on that, and then increase that, augment whatever needs to be augmented, to just make sure that we are moving forward. Because as the Swahili say, kuvunjika kwa mwiko si mwisho wa kupika ugali. So just because it did not work out for us the last time does not mean we completely shun it and say forever cannot, not use technology. But I think really we should also think about the role of technology in our processes. We are successfully sending money locally and abroad, and we all know at the end of the day it's about resources. Why are we trusting technology in that, but not able to trust technology in picking a representative? And how come sometimes, in some cases, we say, yes, you have representatives of your party who have successfully gone through, and you say, yes, we trust technology worked in that case, but then in these other cases, it did not work. It either worked or it did not work. So let's just define what a successful electoral system or technological system really looks like. I think that will help us move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynette. Would now like to hear from Francis.
Thank you, Santana. I've got an outstanding request to be allowed to turn on my video because my link collapsed at some point, and I haven't been able to bring my full self into the meeting since then. But because we are running out of time, let me just continue talking. Like Dixon, I am a bit wary of continuously tinkering with the law. So even in a room full of lawyers, I'm usually the first one to say, hey, wait a minute, are you sure we should be going in that direction? And I once told a room full of European diplomats that Kenya probably had better electoral laws than all their countries combined. And they thought I was joking, but I was serious. because we've got to remember the limits of the law in dealing with some of the problems we have. And one of my more interesting areas of exploration is usually the limits of the law in reducing electoral malfeasance. We've tried all manner of things over the years, increasing penalties. But what use is stiffer penalties if you can't arrest and charge those who are messing up with the system. So I think we've got bigger problems than just the law, and we've got to always be careful about going in that direction. But having said that, I'm one of the ones who referred to our evidence laws as outdated. So people who want to look at the place of the courts in dealing with future election challenges, I think evidence law would be a good place to go looking. You can expect lots of battles around things like photos and whether the photo had a certificate and so on. So things like those, while they don't look like they directly address elections, actually tangentially addressing some of the problems that we have, because I think the Supreme Court had to, amongst other things, work with a presumption. And for me, it was a pretty good thing, because if somebody won't open up their servers to you, then there's a rebuttable presumption that there's something they're hiding. So evidence laws would be a good place to look. But there's also likely solutions that might be found around addressing why it is that many of the people who perpetrate election offenses in this country still go scot-free. I remain hopeful that there might be some legal amendments that make it easier for us to pursue those things to conclusion, but with the eternal caution that it's not always about the law. It's pretty much the same caution that we also have on technology. But on technology, if we revise our definition of technology to not only include things like EVID and BVR and RTS, you know, even the first Flintstone that Stone Age man used was technology. With that revised definition, I don't think we have a choice. We must use technology. The question before us is, how do we keep improving on technology over time, learning lessons from when it didn't work for us and why, and then improving it as we go along. I'm not sure that in the banking sector, we want to go back to a life without ATMs. On elections, we decided to transmit results the way we decided because of its efficiency. In a world where we want fast food and fast God knows what else, I'm not sure you want to go back to the system we had where you're waiting for a guy to arrive from Tarakaniti. So efficient transmission of election results is part of what we are going to have to live with. So the idea is to solve these problems without creating new ones. Because the old problems that Dixon spoke to was a guy being waylaid between the polling station and the returning, the counting center. You want to make sure that those sorts of things don't happen again. And I don't think going back to something that wholly relies on paper would be the way forward. I think the way forward is to keep asking ourselves, last time, this piece of technology didn't work for us. Why? And then fix that and keep doing that. And I think it was Lynette herself who said, let's face it, it's also pretty early in our election cycles using this technology, and maybe it will keep improving election cycle by election cycle. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And that's why for me, before my technology did a number on me, I was going to say, please allow Lynette to speak. Because on the question of whether we can use technology for accountability, I really wanted to hear her answer to that, because I hear as a layman on technology that every time you go into a server and do things, you leave a footprint. Maybe that's where the answer is. So we might never get to the point where we can't prevent anybody from fiddling with a server, but we can prove that it was fiddled with, and that should be a good thing. Thank you.
We can't hear.
Oh, sorry. Would now like to hear the parting shots from the panelists on the topic that we've discussed today, and we'll begin with Sima.
Thank you. I agree that it's hard not to respond to what Francis just said, which is, of course, we want a more efficient system, and that's why we have an electronic results transmission system. The problem is neither of the times that it's been used has it actually given us a more efficient system. So both times we ended up again relying on people manually transporting paper forms from all over the country to Nairobi. So if that is the reality, then I think the way forward is to accept that that will be part of the process, whether we have technology involved or not, and figure out how to make that more reliable and more credible. In terms of going forward, I like I said before, I'm anxious and eager to hear from the Iabc on what has changed between 2017 and now, so that stakeholders can adequately prepare for what to expect and what to watch out for, what may be better, what we haven't been able to address so far, etc. I think then we will be in a much better position to think about what's necessary. And I would say that, as we said in 2017, if the Iabc can establish itself more sort of assertively as the primary point of information for the public, so come out regularly with concise and comprehensive information at each stage of the process, I think the public will also be in a much better position to be able to accurately assess what's going on. Thank you so much to ICJ and my co-panelists.
Thank you, Sima. You raise a valid point that what has changed from 2017 and now, 2022, because one of this, I think Einstein said that if you keep doing things the same way and expect a difference, then you're insane. So we expect IBC to make some reforms as well. We'd now like to hear from Dixon on your parting shots.
Very quickly, just to build on what Sima said and maybe to correct any misconceptions that might arise out of my earlier statements. So when I talk personally about Francis, about the need to sort of think about what is the base of our system, I'm personally motivated by a totally different argument. But ultimately, it's about discerning the will of the voter. And in the Kenyan context, expressed through a handwritten vote on a ballot paper, not an electronic vote. And that then makes its ways into another form which aggregates the numbers at that particular polling station and then moves to the city capital, wherever IEBC or the Election Commission is. And it's aggregated and we get the final numbers. So anything in between is facilitative, right? Because yes, you will leave a digital footprint. You will have metadata from the database and all those manner of things. You can even become nerdy and ask yourself, can you audit the signal itself, right? Because sometimes I think we get so caught up by the fact that the system itself has failed, right? That Francis is no longer online because his camera is not working. But we know that Francis is still there. And when we hear his voice, we can confirm that despite the fact that the camera is not working, Francis is there. So trying to build integrity and reliability behind so that Francis is still there is what to me is most important. And, I'll give another example. In the year, I guess, of 2011, thereabout, I participated in a function where the mayor of a city in Palo Alto, and this is significant because Palo Alto was then sitting at the heart of the Silicon Valley, the technological world, was receiving an award for the city which is best sort of using technology in governance. And midway through his speech, there was a problem. And then, he took it in stride. And what he said was very revealing. That, look, I am seated here right in the middle of Palo Alto, but my internet has just crashed on me. And the whole discussion and presentation was online. And so right there was really the emphasis on what is the backup system and how do we build reliability to it. I know, Francis, that when you go to presentations, you probably carry a paper copy of your presentation so that if everything else fails, you are using that. And I think that is what Sima is saying. How do we invest in that backup reliable system? How do we agree on the standards upon which we will evaluate that backup system so that when that sort of screen crashes at Bomas of Kenya, everybody knows this is what I'm going to and it works, and that we're investing equally in building that system. Look, I think that technology, as we've all agreed, will continue to be a part of this. That technology is evolving. Francis has talked about Flintstone. I've talked about 5G. We've talked about artificial intelligence. Where it takes us is a story of human progress. So what we must challenge ourselves is, how do we improve along harnessing that technology, but while addressing the deficits we see in the system, which are, of course, mostly human, but could also go to issues of will of humans. So for me, as we go into the next election, early planning is important, resourcing is important, making sure that we're testing the system is important. But if we can be bound by 3 principles: one, that we ensure that we take all measures to build transparency. And that can be unloaded to many other things, including deliberate actions we take to avail data, to avail information to political stakeholders, to citizen observer groups, and so on and so forth. So transparency, very important, particularly in the context of elections. 2, how inclusive are we? And Sima was again referring to this when she talked about the committee. How do we build avenues for others to be involved? We respect the mandate, the independence of the Election Commission, but how do we make sure that they carry everybody along in that particular process? And then lastly, I think, which relates to the legal question, is how then do we remain accountable to what the law, the procedures, and the rules set as processes? Those, I think, are 3 key principles as we evaluate how technology operates and is implemented, not just in Kenya, but anywhere where it is implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Dixon. Indeed, we need transparency, inclusivity, in order for also the citizens to trust the process, so that at the end, they also don't come back to question what happened. When things are done in secrecy, like we saw last time, there ends up being so many disputes. Would also like to hear from Lynette, your parting shot on this issue.
Lynette looks frozen.
We can move to Francis while we wait for Lynette to come back. Francis, please give us your parting shot.
Thank you. Hopefully Lynette is not in Palo Alto. I liked that. And on a light note, Dixon, my efforts to get my video back on got even more frantic when Santana called you Francis. I think in terms of my parting shot, I'll go back to the beginning, which for me is the standards that the Constitution has set, in particular, what is in Article 86. That's what we are all trying to achieve, because we want a process that reflects the free franchise of Kenyans. Kenyans of all shades of opinion, all shades of persuasion, and so on. And I think as long as we keep trying to improve the tools with which we are trying to achieve that, then we are on a good journey in terms of human progress, and we should continue without relenting. What we should avoid, is because we've had a setback, we now throw everything that we've built on in the past in trying to get something new, because most innovation, thinking about Palo Alto, is actually not radical. Because I think the mistake we sometimes make on these things is to try and throw away the old completely and bring in something totally new. What we need with the issue of technology in elections is actually incremental innovation. You take something you used before and improve it. And I join issues very much with what Seema said. We shouldn't assume that things will work well. In fact, thinking technology, the lesson I took from Lynette is you should be an eternal pessimist. Despite your best arrangements, something could still go possibly wrong. And that's why for technology people, the very idea of redundancy is an important thing. So Seema's initial suggestion of redundancy being built around the paper-based system, I see nothing wrong with that. It's just that eventually, what you then will have is you've had these fairly quick results come in, and now because they were not good enough, you're going to have to build in the time to wait for the paper-based system to come up. And that usually takes time because it's humans carrying ballot boxes full of paper arriving in some place so that things can be verified. If we accept that that's going to take time, what we then need to deal with, which for me is really fundamental, is the almost irreversible expectation we have created in electoral stakeholders that as soon as polling stations close, results are going to begin trickling in. And if you've ever been in this environment, either as an observer or as a candidate, you know that with every additional day it takes, the worry that somebody is cooking something increases. Yeah. So efficiency is not just for efficiency's sake. We are not being people who are basically chasing a fad here. That efficiency is important because we've got stakeholders' expectations riding on it, and we've got to take care of that. But that's not to say that these things have easy answers. I am completely happy about the debate we've had. Thanks to my fellow panelists, I've learned a lot as well from them. Thank you, Seema, for instance, for reminding me that we haven't heard about much. We haven't heard much about ITAC because it was declared unconstitutional. So progress is like that. We will try something. We think we are going in a good direction, and then we will have some reversal. We mustn't lose the urge to continue doing things to improve, because as Dixon said repeatedly, that is the story of human progress, and we have to stay the course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. Indeed, the efficiency is very important. The reason why they delay in the transmission is not understood because we've been observers, and the counting usually ends by the time we're leaving the polling station. So I would like to hear from Lynette.
Yes.
Is she back?
I think I am. My video is disabled, and I do like to think of my little office as a little Palo Alto and look at how that has turned out. But my closing remarks, Francis, yes, I think accountability is very possible. We built solutions and technologies with audit trails. You should be able to see who's gone in, who's done what. Question is, who has the voice to ask the questions, to say between this day and this day, show me who was in the system and who was able to, and what actions they did to. So that is at the very, it's building for security. So security by default, really, and that should be possible. I really like something else you said, Francis, when it comes to incremental innovation. And a point I actually had that contributes to is, think about it. We've only used the voting, that entire electoral system for a maximum of 1 day, 2 days at most, right? So far, we technically have 2 iterations of the system, and those 2 are not the same, and the system we're going to use in 2022 is completely different from the system we used in 2017, in October, and the system that was probably used in August. think about, your M-Pesa. Why is it reliable today? Because M-Pesa is used every single day, every single second. There's someone using it. Safaricom is consistently looking at what's happening, what's working, what's failing. They're monitoring for bugs and improving. And that's why we are where we are today. Think about Twitter, think about Facebook, where those systems were when they were launched versus where they are today. It's two completely, different things. But electoral systems are only used once, they're discarded, and you start, so pretty much you're using version 0.1 of a system in a live election. So you really, in terms of that incremental innovation, in systems you develop and then you improve in agile, software development. You develop a small core and then you start improving. So if what we had used in 2013 was still the same system to be used in 2022, but we took those lessons in the two elections that have happened in between and improved on those, I would confidently say that then we have a robust system moving forward. But what we have now is a completely new system that has not been tested on any other election being used on a live election. So it's very, and that is why I go back to defining success. It's very hard or difficult to really say it will work 100%, because then the various aspects of this system are not known. And then finally, points that I really want us to think about is, Sima mentioned that in the last election, about 25% of, the locations had no network. And do you know why? Because the government does not invest in these locations. Because the government, in this case, the Iabc, is relying on Safaricom's network. So if Safaricom does not have a commercial interest in a location, that location then, the ripple effect is in an election, that location does not get to enjoy the use of technology in the electoral process. So if the government was able to invest in rolling out the network across the country, everywhere, without the thought about commercial interest, in working maybe with the private sector and doing some of these things, then it would be easier for us to get to 100% when we're thinking about, transmission. In some cases, IBC has spent so much money buying satellite phones that ended up not being used because then they did not work. So in terms of use of technology, we also have to think about the infrastructure that supports that technology and not relying 100% on the private sector, because the private sector is rightfully so driven by commercial interest. So if there's no commercial interest in Wajir, for example, then the people in Wajir, when it comes to their access of government services, then end up suffering. So those are some of the things that we really need to think about. I do not have the solutions today. Maybe given more time, we can think about this, but it has been a very, very amazing conversation that we've had today. So I'd like to really thank ICJ and my fellow panelists for this very interesting and lively conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all. We'll now like to conclude. But fellow Kenyans, information technology and ICT systems are essential to achieving a credible electoral outcome. However, its risks and unforeseen challenges will need to be mitigated and lessons learned from previous elections taken into account. This is because globally, the process of integrating technology and elections are increasingly becoming important.
Yeah, Santana, that's true. Indeed, the reliability of technology will be vital if Kenya is to emerge from the current electoral predicament. Technology does not provide solutions to overcome mistrust and fraud amongst political players. As we all agree, utilization of electoral technologies is highly dependent on the political context in which it is applied. We need stakeholders' consensus and political will to ensure that this is successful. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me take this opportunity to thank our able panelists who have brought here with them and shared with us their knowledge and experience. You panelists have guided our deliberations in the right direction, and we truly appreciate that. We understand that you have taken your time out of your very important schedules to contribute to this forum. Thank you all for your invaluable contribution and participation. I would also like to sincerely thank my colleagues at the ICJ Kenya Council and ICJ Kenya Secretariat who have worked tirelessly around the clock to ensure that this webinar is a success. This is just but the beginning of this conversation. Please be on the lookout for more. I wish you a great afternoon ahead. It has been a pleasure to moderate these discussions. Until next time, thank you and God bless Kenya. God bless Africa. Bye-bye.
Bye.